Hashtag the knocking beneath Grimson's light. What would you do if you were sent to dismantle a lighthouse, and something beneath the foundation started knocking back? Not random settling. Not pipes. Not wind. Organized, rhythmic knocking, a pattern that 3 separate engineers, working on 3 separate nights, described in identical detail. A pattern that, when later analyzed by a linguist at the University of Reykjavik, was described as structurally consistent with a form of communication. In 1971, 3 men were sent to take apart the lamp mechanism of a decommissioned lighthouse on Iceland's northwest coast. Within 48 hours, 2 of them refused to return. The third couldn't leave. And when authorities finally opened the sealed stone chamber they found beneath the foundation, what was inside had no business being there. Some of those objects have never been publicly displayed. The Icelandic National Museum has acknowledged their existence exactly once, in a footnote of a 1974 internal report that was never intended for public release. This is the story of Grimson's light. And after 5 months of research, I'm not sure I should have started looking into it at all. To understand what happened in that lighthouse, you first need to understand the place itself, and why it was built where it was built. Iceland's Westfjords are, by almost any measure, one of the most remote inhabited regions in Europe. The landscape is volcanic, treeless, carved into deep fjords by glaciers that retreated thousands of years ago and left behind a geography that feels alien, like the bones of some enormous creature half submerged in the North Atlantic. The weather is ferocious. The winters are dark in a way that most people in the lower latitudes cannot meaningfully comprehend. We're talking about weeks where the sun doesn't rise. Where the horizon and the ocean become the same shade of iron gray, and the only way you know the difference between sky and sea is the sound. Grimson sits on a spit of basalt rock jutting out from the Strandir coast, a region that even by Westfjord standards is considered isolated. The nearest village, Djupavik, is a former herring town with a population that has hovered in the single digits for decades. There is one road in. It is unpaved. In winter, it is frequently impassable. The lighthouse was constructed in 1923 by the Icelandic Maritime Administration as part of a broader effort to reduce shipwrecks along the Strandir coast, which have been claiming vessels for centuries. Historical records from the Danish colonial period list the waters off Grimsons as among the most dangerous in the North Atlantic, not just because of rocks and currents, but because of something the old shipping logs describe with an unusual word, Beloljos. False lights. Now, false lights, or wreckers' lights, are a well-documented phenomenon across maritime history. In Cornwall, in the Outer Banks, in dozens of coastal communities, there are records of people deliberately setting misleading lights on shore to lure ships onto rocks so they could salvage the cargo. It was a brutal, murderous practice. And the Strandir coast has its own version of these stories. But here's what's strange about the Grimsons' accounts. The false lights were reported for at least 200 years before there was any permanent settlement in the area. Danish trade records from as early as 1703 reference captains warning each other about lights on the Grimsons headland, lights that moved, lights that pulsed, lights that appeared to respond to the position of approaching vessels. There was nobody living there. There hadn't been anyone living there, as far as anyone knew, since the medieval period. And yet the lights kept appearing. When the lighthouse was built in 1923, the construction crew reported something that made it into the foreman's log but nowhere else. While digging the foundation, they hit a layer of worked stone approximately 3 meters below the surface. Not natural basalt. Cut stone. Fitted together without mortar in a style that the foreman described as unlike anything Icelandic. He sketched it in the margin of his log. The sketch shows interlocking polygonal blocks, 5-sided, 6-sided, fitted with a precision that suggests serious engineering knowledge. The foreman's recommendation was to halt construction and notify the National Museum. His superiors overruled him. The lighthouse was needed. Ships were sinking. The worked stone was broken through, the foundation was poured on top of it, and the Grimsons' light began operation in November 1923. For the next 47 years, it functioned without major incident. Almost. I say, almost, because there is a pattern in the lighthouse keeper logs that becomes visible only when you read them in sequence, all 47 years of them. I was able to access digitized copies through the Icelandic Maritime Administration's archive, which was partially open to researchers in 2016. Most of the entries are mundane. Weather. Lamp maintenance. Supply deliveries. But scattered throughout, roughly once every 18 months to 2 years, there are entries that break the pattern. The first is from 1927. The keeper, a man named Bjorn Halldórsson, writes, "Heard sounds from below again. Like someone working stone. Checked the cellar. Nothing. Again." He says, again, which means this wasn't the first time, but there's no prior entry describing it. Either he mentioned it to someone verbally and didn't log it, or an earlier entry was removed. 1931, different keeper. John Einarsson. Cannot sleep. The rhythm from below the floor has continued for 3 nights. It is not mechanical. It speeds and slows as if breathing. 1934, same keeper. I have begun to feel observed when descending to the lower level. The rhythm has changed. It now includes pauses of precise duration. I timed them. The pauses are exactly 11 seconds. 11 seconds. Hold that number. 1941, new keeper. Guðmundur Sigurðsson. A single terse entry, I will not go below anymore. No explanation. No follow-up. He served for 3 more years and never mentioned it again. 1949, keeper Olafur Bream writes what is perhaps the most unsettling entry in the entire log. I'm going to read it in full because the language matters. It is the 4th night of continuous sound from beneath the foundation. I have determined that it is knocking, not mechanical vibration, not settling, not any phenomenon I can attribute to the structure or the sea. It is knocking. It follows a pattern. Groups of 3, then groups of 5, then groups of 7. Then silence for 11 seconds. Then the pattern repeats. I placed my hand on the floor during the knocking. The stone is warm. There is no mechanical or geothermal reason for the stone to be warm. I am requesting reassignment. Groups of 3. Groups of 5. Groups of 7. Silence for 11 seconds. 3. 5. 7. 11. Those are consecutive prime numbers. A linguist named Dr. Katrin Bjornsdottir at the University of Reykjavik would later describe this exact pattern as a contact sequence, a type of mathematical signaling designed to demonstrate intelligence. It's the same principle behind the Arecibo message that humanity broadcast into space in 1974. You send primes because primes are universal. They're not cultural. They're not linguistic. They exist independent of any civilization. If you want to prove to an unknown listener that you are intelligent, that you are not random noise, you send primes. Something beneath that lighthouse was sending primes. And it had been doing it, on and off, for decades. By 1970, the Grimson's light had become obsolete. Modern navigation technology, radar, improved charts, the old coastal lighthouses were being phased out across Iceland. Grimson's was scheduled for decommission in the spring of 1971. The lamp mechanism, a second-order Fresnel lens manufactured in Paris in 1921, was considered historically valuable and was to be carefully removed and transported to the Maritime Museum in Reykjavik. The Icelandic Maritime Administration sent a 3-man engineering team to handle the removal. Their names are in the public record: Magnus Orsteinsson, Einar Johannesson, and Stefan Karlsson. Magnus was the team lead. All 3 were experienced technicians who had performed similar decommissions at other lighthouses around Iceland's coast. They arrived at Grimson's on March 14, 1971. The first day was uneventful. They assessed the lamp mechanism, catalogued components, and set up equipment in the lighthouse's ground floor workspace. The weather was poor but manageable. They planned to sleep in the lighthouse, as the nearest accommodation was over 2 hours away by road, assuming the road was passable at all. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, Magnus was awakened at approximately 2:40 in the morning by what he described in his subsequent report as a rhythmic percussion originating from beneath the floor of the ground level. He went downstairs to investigate. The sound was clear, steady, and, in his words, deliberate. He woke Einar and Stefan. All three listened together. Here is what they heard, as described independently in their separate reports filed with the Maritime Administration, reports that were not shared between them before filing. Magnus, 3 knocks, pause, 5 knocks, pause, 7 knocks. Then a longer silence. Then it repeated. Einar, rhythmic knocking in groups. I counted 3, then 5, then 7. The silence between cycles was consistent. Stefan, a pattern of knocking from below. 3 strikes, 5 strikes, 7 strikes. The gap before repetition was about 11 seconds. 3. 5. 7. 11 seconds of silence. The exact same pattern described by keeper Olafur Bream 22 years earlier. 3 separate men, in 3 separate written reports, described the identical sequence independently. These reports still exist in the Maritime Administration archive. I have copies. I had them verified by an independent researcher in Reykjavik who confirmed the document reference numbers and filing dates. This was not suggestion. This was not misremembering. This was not the wind. What happened next is where the story fractures into something harder to explain. On the morning of March 16, Magnus radioed the Maritime Administration and reported the sounds. He requested guidance. The response, logged in the radio communication record, was terse, complete removal of lamp mechanism. Note any structural anomalies. Do not investigate substructure without authorization. Do not investigate substructure. This phrasing suggests that someone at the Maritime Administration already knew, or at least suspected, that there was something beneath the lighthouse worth mentioning. You don't tell someone not to investigate something unless you have reason to believe there's something to investigate. Magnus complied. They returned to work on the lamp mechanism. That evening, the third night, the knocking resumed. But it was different. Stefan's report describes it, the pattern changed at approximately 0100 hours. The 357 sequence continued for approximately 20 minutes, then ceased. After a silence of approximately 2 minutes, a new pattern began. Single knocks at irregular intervals. They were louder. The floor vibrated. Einar placed his hand on the stone and removed it immediately, stating that it was hot. The warm stone. The same detail from Olafur Bream's 1949 log entry. Einar's report adds a detail that Stefan's does not. During the irregular knocking phase, I had the distinct impression that the knocks were responsive. When one of us spoke or moved, the next knock seemed to come sooner. When we were silent and still, the intervals lengthened. I cannot prove this. It was an impression. But it was strong enough that I told the others, and they agreed. The knocking was listening to them. At 3:15 a.m., Magnus made a decision that contradicted his orders. He went to the ground floor, pulled back the heavy rubber matting that covered the stone floor, and examined the foundation. In his report, he describes finding what the 1923 foreman had found, the work stone, the polygonal interlocking blocks, visible through a gap where the poured concrete foundation had cracked over the decades. But he found something else. A seam. A straight, deliberate line in the work stone that described the outline of what he believed to be a sealed hatch or door, approximately 1 meter by 1.5 meters. He photographed it. The photograph exists. I have seen it. It shows exactly what he described, dark basalt blocks with a clearly defined rectangular outline, the seam barely wide enough to fit a knife blade, but unmistakably intentional. The knocking, he reported, was loudest directly above this seam. Einar refused to continue working at the lighthouse. He walked to Japavik that night, a 2-hour hike in near total darkness along an unpaved road in March, rather than spend another night in the building. Stefan followed the next morning. Only Magnus remained, and in his report, he describes his reason with a sentence that has stayed with me since I first read it: I felt that leaving would be noticed. He doesn't say, I felt I should stay to complete the job. He doesn't say, professional obligation. He says he felt that leaving would be noticed. By what? By whom? Magnus remained at the lighthouse for 4 more days, alone, until an authorization to investigate the substructure was finally granted. He reported that the knocking continued every night. He reported that the patterns grew more complex. And he reported one thing that appears nowhere in the official summary and only in his unedited field notes, which were donated to the University of Reykjavik by his family after his death in 2003. On the 5th night alone at Grimson's, Magnus knocked back. 3 knocks. 5 knocks. 7 knocks. The lighthouse went silent. Completely silent. No knocking. No wind noise, though the wind was blowing at over 50 kilometers per hour outside. No sound of the sea. Nothing. He describes it as the most absolute silence I have ever experienced. As if the building had been removed from the world. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Then something knocked back. Not from below. From directly behind him. Inside the room where he was sitting. His field notes end there. That entry is the last thing he wrote at Grimson's. Whatever happened in the remaining days before the excavation team arrived, he either chose not to record it or couldn't bring himself to. The excavation began on March 23, 1971. A 4-person team from the Icelandic National Museum, led by archaeologist Dr. Helgi Sigurðsson, no relation to the 1941 lighthouse keeper, arrived with equipment to open the sealed chamber beneath the foundation. The work took 2 days. The concrete foundation had to be carefully broken through to avoid damaging whatever was underneath. Once they reached the work stone layer, they confirmed what the 1923 foreman and Magnus had observed: precisely cut polygonal basalt blocks, fitted without mortar, with a craftsmanship that Dr. Helgi described in his preliminary report as comparable to the finest Incan or pre-Incan stonework, but executed in North Atlantic basalt. Comparable to Incan stonework. In Iceland. On a headland that historical records say was uninhabited for centuries before the lighthouse was built. The sealed hatch was opened on March 24. Beneath it was a vertical shaft, approximately 4 meters deep, cut into the living rock of the headland. At the bottom of the shaft was a chamber. Dr. Helgi's preliminary report describes the chamber as roughly circular, approximately 3 meters in diameter, with walls of the same polygonal stonework. The ceiling, which was the underside of the hatch, was a single slab of basalt estimated to weigh over a ton. The chamber was dry. The air inside, when tested, was breathable but had an unusual chemical composition, slightly elevated levels of sulfur dioxide and an unidentified organic compound that the University of Iceland's chemistry department later described as unlike any known geological or biological emission. Inside the chamber were 5 objects. 5 things that nobody has been able to fully explain. The first was a stone basin, roughly half a meter in diameter, carved from a single piece of obsidian. Obsidian is volcanic glass. It exists in Iceland, but the nearest natural obsidian deposits are in the interior highlands, over 200 kilometers from Grimson's. The basin was polished to a mirror finish. When Dr. Helgi looked into it, he noted, and this detail appears in his handwritten field notes, not in the formal report, that his reflection seemed delayed. He moved his hand, and the reflection moved a fraction of a second later. He attributed this to fatigue and poor lighting. 2 other team members reported the same phenomenon independently. The second object was a collection of bone tools, 6 of them, arranged in a precise radial pattern around the basin. Bone composition analysis conducted at the University of Iceland determined they were made from whale bone, specifically North Atlantic right whale. Carbon-14 dating placed their age at approximately 900 CE, plus or minus 50 years. This predates the traditional date of Icelandic settlement by only a few decades, which is interesting but not impossible. What is harder to explain is the workmanship. The tools showed evidence of being shaped with metal implements, but the metallurgical analysis of the cut marks suggested a type of steel that shouldn't have existed in the North Atlantic in the 9th century. The third object was a flat stone tablet, roughly the size of a large book, inscribed on both sides with symbols. These symbols do not correspond to any known runic alphabet. They do not correspond to Ogham, to any Celtic script, to any Mediterranean writing system, to any form of notation that has been identified before or since. Dr. Helge photographed the tablet extensively. In 1973, photographs were sent to the University of Copenhagen, the British Museum, and the Smithsonian. All three institutions responded with some variation of, "We cannot identify this script." The British Museum's response included the sentence, "The systematic nature of the inscription strongly suggests a true writing system rather than decorative marking, but we are unable to propose a linguistic affiliation." A true writing system that no one can read. Carved on stone found sealed beneath a lighthouse on one of the most remote coastlines in Europe. The fourth object was a small, spherical stone, almost perfectly round, approximately 8 centimeters in diameter. It was made of a material that initially appeared to be magnetite but, upon closer analysis, contained trace elements in a ratio that the University of Iceland's geology department described as non-naturally occurring. The stone had a persistent magnetic field, unremarkable for magnetite, but the field was unusual. It was not uniform. It pulsed at regular intervals. A magnetometer test conducted in 1972 measured the pulsations at intervals of, and I need you to hear this, exactly 11 seconds. 11 seconds. The same interval of silence between the prime number knocking sequences. The same 11 seconds reported by keeper after keeper over decades. Encoded in the magnetic field of a stone sealed in a chamber that predates the lighthouse by at least 1,000 years. The fifth object was the one that the Icelandic National Museum has never publicly displayed and has acknowledged only in that single 1974 internal footnote. It was a human skull. Carbon dating placed it at approximately 800 CE, older than the bone tools, older than the traditional settlement of Iceland. Pre-settlement. Before the Norse arrived. Before anyone, according to the accepted historical record, lived in Iceland. But that's not the part that disturbed the researchers. The skull showed evidence of trepanation, a hole deliberately cut into the cranium, a practice known across many ancient cultures, usually interpreted as a form of surgery or ritual. The trepanation hole in this skull was perfectly circular, approximately 3 centimeters in diameter, with edges so smooth and uniform that the physical anthropologist who examined it wrote, "This was not performed with any hand tool I can identify." The precision suggests mechanical assistance, but the dating makes this impossible. And inside the skull, lodged in the cranial cavity where the brain would have been, was a small object. A rounded piece of worked metal, approximately the size of a walnut, made of an alloy that, according to the metallurgical analysis, contained iron, nickel, and iridium in a ratio consistent with meteoric iron. Not smelted. Not forged in any conventional sense. Shaped, somehow, into a form that the analysts described with a word they clearly struggled with. They called it mechanical. A mechanical object made of meteoric iron, found inside a pre-settlement skull, sealed in a chamber beneath a lighthouse where something had been knocking in prime numbers for decades. I need to pause here because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this sounds like a creepypasta. This sounds like fiction dressed up as research. And I understand that impulse because I had it too. I had it every step of the way through 5 months of looking into this. So let me tell you what I can verify, what I can partially verify, and what I cannot verify. This matters. This is the difference between investigation and storytelling. I can verify that the Grimson's lighthouse existed. Maritime Administration records confirm its construction in 1923 and decommission in 1971. The lighthouse is still standing. You can see it on satellite imagery. You can, in theory, visit it, though the road is nearly impassable and locals will advise strongly against it. I can verify that 3 engineers were sent to remove the lamp mechanism in March 1971. Their names appear in Maritime Administration work orders. Their individual reports are on file. I can verify that an archaeological excavation occurred in March 1971. Dr. Helgi Sigurðsson was a real person, an archaeologist at the National Museum of Iceland. His preliminary report exists. I have seen references to it in academic bibliographies, though the report itself has been reclassified as restricted access since 1976. I can partially verify the objects. The bone tools and the obsidian basin are referenced in a 1973 National Museum acquisition log. The stone tablet is mentioned in correspondence between the museum and the British Museum. The magnetic stone is described in a University of Iceland Geology Department report from 1972. The skull and the metal object inside it are referenced only in the 1974 internal footnote. I cannot independently verify the Lighthouse Keeper logs prior to the digitization project, which began in 2014. I have the digitized versions. I cannot confirm they haven't been altered. I cannot verify Magnus Orsteinsson's personal field notes beyond the word of the family member who donated them and the university librarian who catalogued them. And I cannot verify what I'm about to tell you next, because it comes from a single source, a recorded interview conducted in 2009 by an Icelandic folklorist named Svanhildr Óskarsdóttir, who was collecting oral histories from the Strandir coast. The interviewee was an elderly woman from Djupavik who asked not to be named. The recording is in Icelandic. I had it translated by 2 independent translators to confirm accuracy. The woman says this. My grandmother told me that the point where they built the light was never empty. There was always something there. Before the lighthouse, there was a cairn. Before the cairn, there was a stone. Before the stone, there was a hole in the rock where things were left. Offerings. Not to God. Not to the elves. To what was underneath. She said it had been there since before people came. She said it was waiting for something and that it spoke in numbers because numbers are how it thinks. She said when the lighthouse was built, the light woke it up more. She said the light was the wrong kind of light. She said it would answer back. The wrong kind of light. Remember the Viloljos, the false lights that had been reported on the Grimson's headland for centuries before the lighthouse was built? Lights that moved, lights that pulsed, lights that seemed to respond to approaching ships. What if they weren't false lights at all? What if they were answers? After the excavation in 1971, the sealed chamber was resealed. The objects were removed to the National Museum in Reykjavik. The lighthouse was locked and a fence was erected around the perimeter. The Maritime Administration filed a recommendation that the site be transferred to the National Museum's authority for further study. That transfer never happened. In 1974, a second research team was assembled to conduct a more thorough investigation of the site. The team included 2 archaeologists, a geologist, and a physicist from the University of Iceland. They arrived at Grimson's on September 3, 1974. Their expedition lasted 6 days. The official report describes routine archaeological documentation of the chamber and surrounding geology. But the physicist, a man named Dr. Jonas Arnason, filed a separate addendum to the university that contradicts the official tone entirely. Dr. Jonas had brought a seismograph to measure vibrations in the bedrock. Lighthouses on exposed headlands are subject to significant wave impact, and vibration analysis was a standard part of structural assessment. What the seismograph recorded was not standard. During daylight hours, the readings were normal. Ocean wave impact, wind loading, the expected signatures of a structure on a basalt headland in the North Atlantic. At night, the readings changed. Beginning at approximately 1 a.m. on each of the 6 nights, the seismograph recorded a low-frequency vibration originating from beneath the foundation. Not from the ocean side. From below. The vibration followed a pattern that Dr. Jonas initially assumed was a harmonic of wave action, until he analyzed the frequency and timing. The vibration pulsed in groups. 3 pulses. 5 pulses. 7 pulses. A pause of 11 seconds. Repeat. But there was something else in the seismograph data, something deeper. Beneath the prime number pulses, at a frequency below human hearing, there was a continuous signal. A drone. Perfectly steady, perfectly consistent, at a frequency of 14.09 Hz. This is in the infrasound range, below the threshold of conscious hearing but within the range that has been shown, in numerous studies, to cause feelings of unease, anxiety, disorientation, and the sensation of being watched. 14.09 Hz is not a frequency produced by any known geological process. It's not a resonance of basalt. It's not a harmonic of wave action. Dr. Jonas ran the numbers repeatedly and could not find a natural source. His addendum concludes with a recommendation for immediate and comprehensive subsurface investigation using ground-penetrating radar, extending at least 50 meters below the known chamber. The recommendation was denied. No reason was given. In 1975, the fence around Grimsons was replaced with a heavier barrier. Signs were posted in Icelandic and English, restricted area. No entry. Property of the Icelandic Maritime Administration. The lighthouse had been decommissioned. It had no operational purpose. It belonged to no museum. It served no function. And yet it was fenced, posted, and, according to residents of Japavik, periodically visited by individuals who arrived in unmarked vehicles and stayed for exactly one night before leaving. There are 3 theories about Grimsons that circulate among the small community of researchers who are aware of it. I want to lay each one out fairly and let you decide which one, if any, you find convincing. The first theory is geological. Iceland is one of the most volcanically active places on Earth. The island sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge, directly above a mantle plume. Geothermal activity is everywhere. This theory holds that the knocking, the vibrations, the warm stone, and the infrasound are all products of a localized geothermal phenomenon, perhaps a magma chamber or hydrothermal vent beneath the headland. The prime number pattern is coincidence. The human mind is wired to find patterns. 3 engineers in a dark lighthouse on a remote coast, primed by isolation and sleep deprivation, heard random geothermal knocking and imposed structure on it. This theory explains some of the phenomena. It does not explain the chamber. It does not explain the objects. It does not explain why the random knocking was described identically by observers separated by decades. It does not explain the 14.09 Hz infrasound signal. And it does not explain the magnetic stone pulsing at 11-second intervals. You can invoke coincidence once. Maybe twice. But there comes a point where coincidence becomes the less plausible explanation. The second theory is archaeological. Iceland's settlement history is incomplete. The traditional narrative says the Norse arrived in the 870s, but there's growing evidence of earlier visitors, Irish monks, possibly pre-Norse Scandinavians, possibly others. This theory holds that the chamber was constructed by a pre-settlement culture whose existence has been largely erased from the historical record. The objects are artifacts of this culture. The knocking is unrelated, geological or structural. The stone tablet is a writing system we haven't decoded because the culture that created it left no other traces. This theory is more satisfying. It addresses the objects. It aligns with emerging scholarship on pre-settlement Iceland. But it strains against several facts. The skull dates to approximately 800 CE, and the trepanation shows a level of surgical precision that is inconsistent with any known 9th century culture. The metal object inside the skull is made of worked meteoric iron in a form that metallurgists called mechanical. And the carbon-14 dates don't all align. The bone tools are from around 900 CE, the skull from around 800 CE. This chamber wasn't built in a single moment. It was used, maintained, and added to over at least a century. That implies a sustained presence. A culture. And that culture left one artifact that no one can read, one skull with something impossible inside it, and a stone that pulses every 11 seconds. The third theory is the one that nobody puts in writing, but everyone familiar with the case arrives at eventually. The theory is that whatever is beneath Grimson's is still active. The chamber the 1971 team found was not the bottom. It was a threshold. A vestibule. The actual structure, whatever it is, extends further down into the bedrock than anyone has been permitted to explore. The knocking isn't an echo of the past. It's ongoing. It's current. It has been ongoing for centuries, possibly much longer. The prime number pattern is not incidental. It is intentional. It is designed to be recognized by any sufficiently intelligent listener. The 14.09 Hz infrasound is not geological. It is generated. The false lights that sailors reported for hundreds of years were not natural phenomena. They were signals. And the objects in the chamber, the mirror basin, the bone tools, the inscribed tablet, the pulsing stone, the skull with its impossible metal implant, were not placed there by whatever is below. They were placed there by people. People who found the source. People who tried to communicate with it. People who built a chamber above it and sealed it shut, not to protect what was inside, but to protect everything else from what was underneath. The cairn before the lighthouse. The stone before the cairn. The hole in the rock before the stone. An unbroken chain of human attempts to mark, to contain, to manage something that was there before any of them arrived. And then, in 1923, someone built a lighthouse on top of it. A building whose entire purpose was to produce light. The wrong kind of light. A light that, for 47 years, shone out across the North Atlantic, broadcasting into the darkness. Not warning ships away from the rocks. Signaling. I want to tell you about Magnus Orsteinsson's last years because I think they matter. After the 1971 decommission, Magnus returned to Reykjavik. He continued working for the Maritime Administration for another 12 years before retiring in 1983. His colleagues described him as competent but increasingly withdrawn. He never married. He lived alone in a small apartment in the Vesterberg neighborhood. In 1998, 5 years before his death, he gave a single interview to a student journalist at the University of Iceland who was writing a thesis on the decommissioning of Icelandic lighthouses. The interview was supposed to be about logistics and engineering. It became something else. The student's transcript, which was included in the thesis and is available in the university library, records Magnus saying the following. I have never stopped hearing it. I want to be clear about that. I don't mean I remember it. I mean I hear it. Every night. 3, 5, 7. 11 seconds. It began at Grimson's and it has never stopped. Doctors say there's nothing wrong with my hearing. Psychiatrists say it's trauma. I say it followed me home. I say when I knocked back, I opened a door. Not the door in the floor. A door in myself. And something came through it. Something that speaks in numbers. Something that is very, very patient. He paused. Then he said. It's not evil. I want people to understand that. I've spent 27 years listening to it and I don't believe it's evil. I believe it's lonely. I believe it has been trying to make contact for a very long time. And I believe the people who built that chamber understood it. They weren't sealing it away. They were maintaining the conversation. They were answering. And when they died, when their culture vanished, the conversation stopped. And it's been knocking ever since. Waiting for someone to knock back. I knocked back. And now I can't unhear it. And the thing is, the thing that keeps me up, the thing I've never told anyone, is that the pattern has changed. It's not just primes anymore. It's becoming more complex. It's learning. And I think it's learning from me. Magnus Orsteinsson died in 2003 at the age of 78. Cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. In his apartment, his family found 32 years of notebooks filled with numbers. Every page, every notebook, nothing but numbers. Primes, at first. Then sequences of increasing complexity, Fibonacci sequences, perfect numbers, Mersenne primes. Mathematical structures of escalating sophistication. He had been continuing the conversation for 32 years. And in the final notebook, on the last page he ever wrote, there was a single sequence of numbers that Dr. Katrin Bjornsdotter, the same linguist who had analyzed the original knocking pattern, described as not a known mathematical sequence. She ran it through every database she could access. No match. It wasn't random. It had structure. But it was new. It was a mathematical statement in a language that doesn't exist in human mathematics. She said, and I quote, "If this sequence originated from Mr. Orstenson's own mind, then he independently invented a novel branch of mathematics in his retirement, which is extraordinary but not impossible. If it did not originate from his mind, then I don't know what to say. Because it is coherent. It means something. I simply don't know what." Grimson's light still stands on the Strander coast. The lamp mechanism was eventually removed, not by Magnus and his team, but by a subsequent crew in late 1971 who worked only during daylight hours and refused to remain on site after sunset. The Fresnel lens is now in a storage facility in Reykjavik. It has never been displayed. The fence around the lighthouse has been replaced twice, most recently in 2011. The sign still worn against entry. Satellite imagery from 2019 shows a small structure, possibly a monitoring station, that was not present in earlier images. No one has claimed responsibility for it. The residents of Djupavik do not talk about Grimsons with outsiders. When the Icelandic folklorist Svanhildr Óskarsdóttir visited in 2009 to collect oral histories, she found that people were willing to discuss almost everything about the Strander coast, its history, its ghosts, its harsh beauty, except the lighthouse. About the lighthouse, they became quiet. One man told her, "We don't go there. Nobody goes there. The light is off but the conversation isn't over. The light is off but the conversation isn't over." In 2017, a group of urban explorers from Reykjavik posted a video online of their attempt to visit Grimsons. The video shows them driving the unpaved road, reaching the headland, and approaching the fence. The video is 43 minutes long. At the 37-minute mark, the audio changes. Over the wind and their voices, there is a faint, rhythmic sound. Low. Steady. The explorers don't acknowledge it. They may not have heard it, it's only clearly audible when the audio is isolated and amplified. 3 beats. 5 beats. 7 beats. Silence. The video was posted to an Icelandic urban exploration forum and received little attention. The audio anomaly was not noticed until 2021, when a sound engineer in Denmark stumbled across the video, isolated the track, and posted his analysis. His analysis confirmed, the rhythmic sound was not an artifact of the recording equipment, not wind interference, not a digital compression artifact. It was present in the raw audio. And it matched, precisely, exactly, the pattern described by Magnus Orstensson, Einar Johannesson, and Stefan Karlsson in 1971. 50 years later. The pattern hasn't changed. The knocking hasn't stopped. I started researching this story in January. It is now June. In 5 months, I have read archived lighthouse logs, engineering reports, archaeological assessments, university correspondence, metallurgical analyses, oral history transcripts, and one dead man's notebooks full of numbers. I have exchanged emails with researchers in Reykjavik, Copenhagen, and Edinburgh. I have spoken with 2 of the 3 living members of the 1974 research team, both of whom confirmed the details I've presented and both of whom asked not to be identified. I have not visited Grimsons. I was planning to. I had a trip scheduled for April. I cancelled it, and I want to be honest with you about why. In March, while I was deep in the research for this piece, I woke up at approximately 2:40 in the morning, the same time Magnus was first awakened, and heard, or thought I heard, a sound. Rhythmic. Faint. Coming from below me. I live in a second-floor apartment. Below me is a concrete slab and a parking garage. I lay there for 5 minutes and counted. 3. 5. 7. Silence. I told myself it was the building's heating system. I told myself it was pipes. I told myself I had been reading too many transcripts of people describing this exact pattern and my brain was imposing it on random noise. And that is almost certainly what happened. The human mind is a pattern recognition engine. Give it enough priming and it will find patterns in anything. Almost certainly. But I cancelled the trip. Because Magnus knocked back, and he heard it for the rest of his life. And I decided I did not want to find out what happens when you get closer to the source. The Grimson's lighthouse stands on its headland, fenced and dark, looking out over water that has swallowed ships for 1,000 years. Something built a chamber in the rock beneath it before the Norse arrived. Something filled that chamber with objects that shouldn't exist. Something sealed it shut with a slab of stone so heavy it took modern equipment to move. And something beneath it all is still knocking. 3. 5. 7. 11 seconds of silence. Waiting for someone to answer. Magnus answered. And whatever he started, it followed him home. It filled 32 years of notebooks. It grew. It evolved. It produced mathematics that a professional linguist described as genuinely novel. What do you think is beneath Grimson's light? Is it geology, blind thermal processes that happen to pulse in primes? Is it archaeology, the remnants of a lost culture so advanced it defies our understanding of the premedieval North Atlantic? Or is it something else? Something that has been in that rock since before human beings set foot on that island? Something that communicates in the only language that doesn't require a shared culture, a shared tongue, a shared history? The language of mathematics. The universal signal. The proof of intelligence. 3. 5. 7. Is anyone listening? What do you think really happened? Leave your theory below.